Good morning, good evening, good afternoon. Welcome to the American Center. Welcome to our third U.S. speaker program in celebration of democracy and the U.S. election. My name's Joshua Camp. I'm one of the cultural affairs officers here at the U.S. Embassy in Dhaka, Bangladesh. Kintu aaj ami Washington DC te theke. I'm so excited that you've joined us for this special presentation. This morning, over about the next 75 minutes, we have an outstanding expert with us, Professor Paul Sracic from Youngstown State University in Ohio, to deliver comments and take your questions about the US electoral process and the fundamentals of the US election system. Your mute has been enabled, so at the moment, you're unable to talk on screen. When you have questions, please submit those questions in the Zoom chat box. I will do my best to consolidate your questions and present them to our speaker, Dr. Sracic. This program will be recorded and later broadcast on U.S. Embassy social media. For all our guests, today we're providing Bengali Sign Language interpretation. Our interpreter, Mr. Ariful Islam, will interpret throughout the entire program. In order to locate the sign language interpreter, please scroll through the gallery view and select Mr. Ariful Islam for sign language. Jodi apni Bangla bolte pari and would like to hear Bangla audio. Today we also offer simultaneous Bengali interpretation. You will be able to hear Bengali spoken at the same time our speaker is presenting in English. To enable Bengali audio, please look at the bottom of your Zoom screen, select the language selection tab, choose Bengali, and then the audio will begin. If you have specific questions or face difficulty accessing Bengali audio, please ask a question in the chat box. Our staff will respond immediately with instructions to access Bangla audio. So, Jodi apni Bangla shunte pare, amra kormachari apni ke sahajo kore. With that, I'm so excited to introduce the Public Affairs Officer for the U.S. Mission to Bangladesh, my boss, Ms. Arlisa Reynolds, with more than 20 years experience representing the United States across the world, in South Asia, in Europe, and Russia, South America. Arlisa Reynolds, over to you.
Good evening, Josh. Good evening, everyone. That was such a nice intro. Really, Josh is my boss. Let's just get this right. Josh is my boss. So it's so great to join you this evening. Assalamu alaikum, Shubho Shonda. Apnadar Majay, Ashtepare, Ami Gorbito, Abon, Kubi, Anodito. Welcome to the American Center for this discussion about U.S. elections and the fundamentals of the U.S. election system, electoral system. Before I get started, on behalf of the U.S. Embassy, I just want to send out our deepest condolences to all of those who have lost loved ones as a result of the coronavirus. To all of those that are still suffering, that are ill, we wish you a speedy recovery. And to all of those, just anyone affected at all, we send our best wishes to the families and loved ones. The pandemic has revealed a lot about true friendships and partnerships. And when I think of true friendships and partnerships, I think of the US and Bangladesh. Over the past 20 years, the United States has provided over $4 billion in total US assistance to Bangladesh. And just in the last, so in the last 20 years, $1 billion in health assistance, and just over the past 6 to 7 months, over 56.5 million to help with COVID assistance. And in return, many of you may know that Bangladesh has also helped the US. In May, Beximco sent 6 million pieces of PPE to the United States, to the American company Haynes, and there are other things in the works. So really it's a partnership to tackle this global pandemic. But our commitment has never been stronger. And as a demonstration of that commitment, many of you may have seen that last week our Deputy Secretary of State, Stephen Biegun, was here in Bangladesh, and there was a lot of great coverage. He met with Sheikh Hasina, Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina, and other members of the government. But tonight, that's enough about the US-Bangladesh partnership. Tonight, we are thrilled to have a fantastic speaker to share with you his knowledge and his experience, Dr. Paul Sracic. I hope you're eager to hear about elections in the US and to ask Dr. Sracic some questions. I am looking forward to this presentation. Although I'm an American citizen, I have to tell you, our election system is complicated. And so it's always wonderful to hear from an expert. To all of you out there, political activists, civil society advocates, alumni of US government exchange program, academics, I'm seeing like media, all different sorts of people. Some of you I've met, some of you I haven't, but we're so delighted you could join us. I was looking at the calendar today, and Dr. Sracic can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think we're about 13 or 14 days away from the elections. So mail-in and early voting has already started happening. I think I heard the other day on the radio, I want to say maybe 20 million people have already voted, and maybe that's changed. Dr. Sracic can correct me, I'm probably wrong, but people are going to the polls every day. And at times like this, it's really important, well, I think about in the US that the founding principle of the US democracy, one of the founding principles were that all people are created equal with the right of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And American democracy over time has been expanding civil rights protections so that we can more fully represent all the people. And that's happened from the beginning, this kind of evolution of how US democracy functions. You may know that after the US Constitution was adopted and signed and ratified, the Bill of Rights almost immediately came into being, and it enshrines specific civil liberty protections. Free speech, dissent, the right to peaceful protest, and then it still took decades for other protections to come into being. For example, just this year, many of you may know, in the US, we celebrated the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment to the Bill of Rights, or the 19th Amendment to the Constitution, sorry, that granted women the right to vote. Since then, we've also had the civil rights of 1964, the voting rights of 1965, that outlawed discrimination based on race and religion and sex. And in 1990, so only 30 years ago, the United States passed the Americans with Disabilities Act, which made it possible for Americans with disabilities, millions of them, to be able to fully participate in our political process and all aspects of American society. I don't want to take too much more time, but I just want to, I guess, mention one other thing, that as the United States, as we prepare for our elections, it's a good time for Americans, and I think Americans are thinking this, and hopefully in Bangladesh, you can think of what you might, your situation, if you were going to an election, like it's a good opportunity for Americans to be thinking right now, is our country living up to the founding democratic ideals and principles? And what could responsible citizens do to help the country reach that status? And basically, what are we doing as citizens? And I know that that is a conversation in America that is taking place now. The story of every democracy has its struggles. Democracies are not perfect. Democracies are messy, but they're also not spectator sports. Elections depend on people showing up. And if you don't vote, then we ignore history and we give away our future. I wanted to quote just really quickly an American icon, civil rights icon, the late Congressman John Lewis. I really love this quote from him. He says, "Freedom is not a state, it is an act. It is not some enchanted garden perched high on a distant plateau where we can finally sit down and rest. Freedom is the continuous action we all must take, and each generation must do its part to create an even more fair and just society." And I truly believe that. Just in conclusion, courageous people inspire a better world. And I hope that all of us, I take this to heart, and I hope you might consider adopting it as one of your mantras to live by, to take to heart what former First Lady and the drafter of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights said, Eleanor Roosevelt, do one thing every day that scares you. And I hope that in whatever we're doing, that we each of us in our lives think about not accepting the status quo, that we will all be champions for democracy and citizen and civil participation, however we can be in our communities. And I hope that I know many of you, I'm looking at the names across the screen, I know many of you already are. You are champions for democracy, and you help others in your community learn how they can also participate. So again, without further ado, thank you very much. We're thrilled that you could join us this evening. Okni Donobad.
Thank you so much, Arlisa. I think your remarks were right on the mark. Nations are made up of people. Our governments in democracies represent the will of those people. And it's our duty as responsible citizens to participate in our government and in our governance. And at no time is that more obvious and necessary than during elections. Today, we're so pleased to have Dr. Paul Sracic, Professor of Politics and International Relations at Youngstown State University in Ohio. Dr. Sracic has been an active U.S. speaker for the State Department. During this election season, Dr. Sracic has participated in more than 50 programs just like this one, with audiences just like you. That means that he is able and willing to answer your questions. These programs are helpful and informative when you ask the questions you want answers to. I can't promise you that we'll answer all questions, but we'll keep going till we run out of time. Professor Sracic is also a Fulbright Scholar. He has twice participated in the US government's flagship academic exchange program. And many of you here in this audience have also participated in US-funded exchange programs. If you're interested to study in the United States or participate in a program like the Fulbright program for academic study and research in the United States, visit the US Embassy website for more information. It is my great pleasure now to introduce Dr. Paul Sracic for his lecture and PowerPoint about the fundamentals of the US electoral system. His program will continue approximately 20 to 25 minutes, after which time I will begin asking your questions from the chat box. Submit your questions in the chat box, please. If you need access to Bangla audio, please submit that question in the comment box as well. Our staff will help you reach Bangla audio. Thank you so much. Dr. Sracic, over to you.
Thank you so much for the kind introduction and all these inspiring words. You know, we are coming up on Election Day in the United States in about 13 days. And some of us actually refer to Election Day as Democracy Day in the United States. As much as you may hear a lot of negative press about US politics, for many of us, it's still a celebration day that we're coming on. So it's really an honor for me to have the opportunity to explain the system to you. So let me share my PowerPoint now, and we will get started. One minute here, I think it's... Okay. Let's begin. I hope you can see the PowerPoint. The picture that I'm showing you of the donkey and the elephant. I enjoy this picture because to many it is somewhat of a visualization of contemporary US politics. We have, as I'll explain in a minute, two major political parties, the Democrats and the Republicans. And for more than 100 years, those two parties have been symbolized by the donkey for the Democrats and the elephant for the Republicans. This goes back to a very old political cartoon that was, over 100 years ago, cartoons in which the political parties were portrayed as these animals. And as with many things in US politics, we simply kept using them, and no one really remembers the foundations. One other thing, these are portraying two sort of boxers in a fight with each other. And if you notice the gloves that they have on, particularly on the left, the elephant, it says GOP. If you follow American politics, you will know that the Republicans actually have two names. They are the Republicans, and they are also the Grand Old Party, GOP. And to help you understand, those terms are used interchangeably when we talk about the parties. Election Day is coming up on November 3rd. But Election Day is, the most important event, but one event in a very, very long election process in the United States. We have been dealing with the presidential election for many, many months, really years. This starts very early when candidates begin raising money. Then we had the primaries where the different parties choose their candidates, the conventions. We're about to have Election Day. And at the end of this lecture, I will tell you about some upcoming events, things that will follow from Election Day as we continue the process of choosing the President of the United States. To begin with some fundamentals. The United States has only two major political parties. This can be a bit deceptive because the parties are so large that they are really, to a degree, coalitions of individuals that don't always agree with each other on everything, but they come together at least every 4 years or every 2 years to run candidates in elections. Given the size of the United States, it is remarkable how evenly divided we are. This is a fairly recent poll by the GALLUP organization, a very well-respected polling group in the United States. And they track party membership. This is a bit of an uncertain term. Later, I will talk to you about a concept called federalism, meaning the kind of power that the states have in the United States. You may think of us as one country, and certainly we are one country, but we are made up of 50, in a sense, almost self-governing parts. And when it comes to whether someone is a member of the Democratic Party or the Republican Party, generally it is up to the individual state parties to determine what the rules are for membership, and sometimes the individual state legislatures. So it is sometimes hard to determine who is really a Democrat and who is really a Republican. It's somewhat unofficial in many places and very fluid. In the state that I live in, it is very easy to move from being a Democrat to being a Republican. You simply decide in what's called a primary election, one of the party elections, you simply decide to join one party or the other. And every few years, you can switch back and forth. There's no payment of a fee or really anything other than simply expressing that you want to participate in the primary election where candidates are selected for that party. So this is a poll where people self-identify. They tell the interviewer which party they are a member of. And you see how evenly divided they are between Republicans and Democrats. This is a snapshot. Right now, you see Republicans have a slight lead. That switches back and forth as we move from month to month. The largest group you see in the middle call themselves independents, that they are not part of either political party. Now, many of these people are really members of one party or the other, but they don't like to express that membership. Americans like to think of themselves as independent actors, not led in politics by any political party. But in reality, that group in the middle, the independents, lean or tend to prefer one party or the other, but they just don't admit to it. Our closely divided political parties are reflected in our very close elections. And at least for the last 20 years, our national election results have been very, very close. Amazingly close, actually. Again, given the number of voters that we are talking about. Hundreds of millions of voters, and they divide fairly equally. We often say we are a 50-50 nation. During our last presidential election, again, the results were very close. Former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton received 48% of the vote, and Donald Trump, current president, received 46% of the vote, approximately. And there were some minor parties that also received votes, which is why this does not total to 100%. Now, when you look at these results, it may seem a bit odd to you that even though Hillary Clinton won a plurality of the vote with 48%, Donald Trump actually won the presidency. And the reason for this, and this is not the first time that we've had this situation, is that the American people do not vote directly for president. We have an indirect system, and we have always had an indirect system for selecting the president. We call this indirect system the Electoral College system. That word college can be confusing in the United States because we associate that with a single place. For example, I teach at a college, which is often another name for a university or a school within a university. But college here means collegial, or a common activity, right? Where all of the electors engage in a common activity. And that activity is electing the president. If you look back in our history, back to 1787, when our Constitution was first written and debated, what the people that wrote the Constitution really wanted was for Congress to elect the president. But they believed in something called separation of powers and what we call checks and balances. They were very suspicious of human nature and of the humans who would occupy political positions. What they wanted was for Congress to control the president and for the president to control Congress, checking or balancing out each other. And their fear was that if Congress elected the president, then the president would not watch over or defend the nation against Congress. So their solution was to invent what is really a one-day Congress. And that is the best way to understand the Electoral College, that they are essentially a mirror of the legislature, one might say. If you want to know how many electors there are, meaning people who vote for the president, the first place to look is how many members of Congress we have, how many people serve in the US House of Representatives, and how many people serve in the Senate. We have 100 senators, 2 for each state, and we have 50 states. And then we have 435 members of the House of Representatives. That number was established by Congress early in the last century, and we have simply remained at 435. 435 plus 100 is 535. In the 1970s, we amended our Constitution. Again, we talked earlier about the continuing democratization of the United States. So we amended the Constitution to grant people who live in what's called the District of Columbia, that area where the White House is and where the Capitol is. It is not a state. It is a special federal zone. And because it was not a state, they could not vote for president. But we amended the Constitution to allow the people of the District of Columbia to participate in presidential elections, granting them 3 electoral votes as if they were a state and had 2 senators and 1 House member. So you take the 535 with the total number of members of Congress, add to that the 3 from the District of Columbia, and that takes us to 538. That is the number of electoral votes. So it's like a very large Congress. The Constitution demands an absolute majority to be elected president. And a majority is 270. So one needs to have 270 electors casting their vote for a person to become the president of the United States. These 538 electors are distributed around the United States. Recall that I told you that this is something like Congress. So we distribute the electoral votes the same way we distribute members of Congress. Every state gets 2 electoral votes for the 2 senators that they have. And then the remaining electoral votes they receive are based on the number of members of the House of Representatives that they send to Washington. And this is based on the relative population of the states. So we have had a number of 435, that's the total number of representatives, and then we distribute those 435 throughout the states based on population. We are currently recounting our population in the United States for the purpose of distributing those members of Congress. The state I live in, if you look to the upper right of the chart, of the PowerPoint, you see OH, the upper right sort of top. And OH is for Ohio. And the state of Ohio has 18 electoral votes because we send 16 people to the House of Representatives. And as with every state, we have 2 senators. So 16 plus 2 is 18. And you see the larger the state is, you see Texas down there at the bottom, the TX. They're a large state, they have 38 electoral votes. And California, all the way on the left of the picture, on the west coast of the United States, California is our largest state. They have the largest population, therefore they have the most votes for president. In the United States, just as we use the elephant and the donkey, for the last 20 years or so, we refer to red, blue, and sometimes purple states. Now, this is actually a creation of the US media. It was a way of visualizing how states vote in presidential elections. The colors are arbitrary. They don't really mean anything, but we tend to use them consistently. And blue is a state that almost always votes for the Democratic candidate for president. And red means the state almost always votes for the Republican candidate for president. The purple is a bit hard to see, so let me change it to basically uncolored states. Here what you see are the states that are blue are the states that we know, even before the election takes place, how they will vote, because they always vote in the same way. I can make a prediction for you today that former Vice President Joseph Biden will win California. And when I say win California, what I mean is that these presidential elections that we talk about, they take place within each state. So what happens is each state votes for one party or the other, for one candidate or the other. And in virtually every state, it is what we call winner take all. So in California, if you receive one more vote than anyone else for president, then you are awarded all of California's 55 electoral votes. These electors are actually people. So Vice President Biden has already selected 55 people who have promised to vote for him for president as electors. And Donald Trump has selected 55 people in California. We will vote on November 3rd, and when we finish counting the votes, those electors will be selected, either the 55 that are pledged or promised to Joseph Biden or to President Trump. And this takes place throughout all 50 states and in the District of Columbia, these individual elections. As I said, however, we already can predict the results in most of the states that we have colored red and blue. Sometimes even these states we get wrong, but generally speaking, we can be confident, for example, that President Trump will win. There's an MO in the middle there, Missouri. The ID in the upper left-hand corner, Idaho. And we know, again, that former Vice President Biden will win California. We know he'll win states like New York on the East Coast, New Jersey. Those are not competitive states. We don't know who will win Florida. If you look down in the lower right corner, the FL, that's the state of Florida. Florida is called a swing state or a purple state. It's a little blue and a little red. We don't know how the election will turn out in that state. And you see there's about 13 or 14 states where we don't know the outcome. When we just take the states where we do know the outcome, neither party has the 270 votes that they need to become president. So these swing states are very important as you go through trying to collect 270 electoral votes. These are the results from 2016. Despite the fact, again, that former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton won about 3 million more votes than Donald Trump won enough states to total more than 270 electoral votes. If you see at the bottom, Florida was won by Donald Trump in 2016. Also up to the sort of the top right, what we refer to as the upper Midwest, states of Ohio, where I live, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin. These are all undetermined states that we are not sure how they will vote. And in 2016, Donald Trump won all of those states. It was very close in many of the states, but he won them. Now, Hillary Clinton won California, and she won by so many extra votes in California that is in part why her popular vote total was so much higher than Donald Trump's. One might argue that his votes were more efficiently distributed than her votes were, which is why he won the presidency. But the rule is, it's not the popular vote winner who becomes president. It's the person who accumulates a majority or more of the electoral votes. So you're looking for 270. My state of Ohio has always voted for the winning candidate since 1960. So we're going on 60 years now. And it's the only state that seems to always pick the correct candidate, the eventual winner. But that doesn't mean you have to win Ohio to become president. Actually, Donald Trump could have lost Ohio in 2016, and he still would have won the presidency. I want to talk to you for a minute, and I'm running short on time, about the concept of federalism, because you cannot really understand US elections unless you understand that we are essentially a federal republic. Right? We are a country that divides up power among the states. And this is very true when it comes to elections. Each state conducts its presidential elections in a slightly different manner and according to its own rules, even down to the point of determining who is allowed to vote. There's different rules in different states. Now, the states are, of course, they cannot simply exclude everyone from voting. But for example, in some states, if you've been convicted of a serious crime, even after you've served your sentence, you are not allowed to vote. In other states, you can vote, even if you've been convicted of a serious crime, once you're released from prison. So different rules like that in different states. And also the actual practical voting rules, what sort of identification one must show before one casts one vote is different in each state. If you follow US politics, you may have heard that there is a lot of debating about mail-in voting. Because of COVID-19, people are nervous about showing up at a particular place to cast their vote. So what we have done is we've initiated other types of methods of voting where one does not have to go to a particular place at a particular time. And we've done this actually for many years, but we're just starting to make use of it more. You may have heard of something called voting by mail, which is somewhat of a new system. And that is where every potential voter in the state is mailed a ballot to fill out. And they can fill it out and mail it back, and that's how they vote. It's somewhat controversial. The Republican Party is not favorable towards it in the United States. However, not that many states use direct vote by mail. Only 10 or really 11 states. And you probably don't recall this from the earlier map, but those are not states for the most part that are undetermined, meaning we already know how the state of Washington, for example, is going to vote, and they use, and have used for quite a long time now, mail-in ballots. So that probably won't be a huge source of controversy after the election. Now, other states, virtually all of the states, do have a process called absentee voting that I want to talk to you about quickly. And we've had that for a very long time. That simply means that for whatever reason, you want to be absent on election day and not actually show up to vote, then you again are allowed to mail in your vote. But for absentee voting, what happens is you have to request a ballot first. It's not automatically sent to you. And after it is sent to you, then you fill it out and mail it back. And there are various ways that different states use to verify that the correct person is voting. Again, I live in the state of Ohio, and that shows you where it is in the United States. For absentee voting, we have no automatic mail voting. You're not automatically mailed through the postal system a ballot. But you can vote absentee by applying for an absentee ballot. After you get it, you can mail that ballot in, or you can get in your car and drive to a local center and drop it off in a special box. Or you can actually go into what we call the Board of Elections, and in each county, which is a political subdivision, there is a Board of Elections, and you can go there and vote in person. If you have seen the lines in the United States that are forming for people to vote now, those are in-person absentee voting. So they don't want to vote, they'll be absent on election day, but they still want to vote in person. So they're lining up to do that. Unfortunately, there are not many places to do that in the United States. On election day, we will have many, many places for people to vote. But prior to election day, we only have a few. That's why we're having these long lines. This is somewhat complicated, and I'm not going to go through all of it. That is a picture of one of the boxes that one would use to drop off one's ballot after it's filled out. You have to use various forms of identification, again, to prove that you are the right person to vote. You're the person who's actually voting. And what's often used is what's called a driver's license number. You have a license to drive that is issued by the state, and that is a unique number that only you possess. Or you can use what's called a social security number. That is our sort of public pension system, which again has a particular number. And there's other forms, but you do have to use some form of identification before you're allowed to vote. Even on election day, again, identification is demanded of you when you go to vote. You have to show an identification, oftentimes with a picture on it, to prove who you are and that you are actually the person listed on the rolls as the voter. Finally, again, this is a long process. We actually, in Ohio, have been voting for the last 2 weeks or so, again, by mail or in person. It will all end on November 3rd. However, some of those mail ballots will take some time to come in. Again, every state has different rules, but in Ohio, we will accept ballots up to 10 days after the election, meaning till November 13th, as long as there is proof that they were mailed prior to election day. So that will slow down the counting a little bit as these mail-in votes come in. We need to be finished with this by December 14th, because on December 14th, these people who have been selected as electors will go to the capitals of their states and they'll cast their votes for president, the actual electoral votes. Those votes will be counted in January in a joint session of Congress, and they will be actually opened by the Vice President of the United States, Mike Pence, and counted at that point. And actually, what happens is if you are running for Vice President, as Mike Pence is, if Joseph Biden and Kamala Harris end up winning, Vice President Pence will have to announce his own defeat, as former Vice President Gore did in 2000 when he lost the very controversial election to George W. Bush. Whoever has a majority of electoral votes will then be inaugurated as president on January 20th. And with that, I will stop because I've gone a bit too long and take your questions. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. And Dr. Sracic, certainly you did not go too long. I could listen to you for hours. I learned a great deal. As we heard during your talk, the US election system seems a bit complicated. It's not a simple each citizen, one vote, count them all up, and answer. It seems like each state has its own rules. From our participants and viewers, why is the US system so complicated? Why did the framers and founders of the United States create an electoral college? And in a democracy, isn't the will of the people through a direct election more fair? Do you think the United States will ever implement a direct election for president? If so, How is that possible to modify existing law? Thank you.
Well, there's many questions there. So let's start from the beginning, from our founding. It's very important to understand that the United States was the coming together of separate states. And back at our founding period in 1787, the states thought of themselves as independent countries. And they were reluctant to come together in too close of a union. There has always been, or there was, a lot of tension, for example, between the southern states, which, as you may know, practiced slavery, and the northern states that did not. And there was a nervousness about sort of coming together in one union. We had a constitution, by the way, prior to the one that we talk about now, something called the Articles of Confederation, which loosely bound the states together. We had problems. We couldn't handle national problems that we had, national economic problems, trade problems. So we decided we needed a stronger union. That is the current constitution. But there still was a reluctance to have too close of a union. And that's shown in the Constitution, where the federal government is given only certain limited powers. There are many things the federal government is simply not allowed to do. You might have followed the debate in the United States over a national healthcare system. And that became a constitutional debate about whether Congress had that power. Now, this is reflected in our election system that is essentially run in 50 different places. As to why we didn't allow for a direct popular vote in 1787, it was because at the time, the people that wrote the Constitution didn't think the people could possibly know who to vote for. Obviously, it's not a time of modern technology, national press, a national media. Many people were not literate, could not read and write, so there would be no way for them to know who to vote for. At the Constitutional Convention, they talked about allowing the people to vote for president was like asking someone who was unable to see to select the proper colors. It was not that the person was not intelligent enough to make the choice, but they simply wouldn't. If you could not see, you cannot tell colors, right? So you wouldn't have the information necessary to make a choice. And that's why they did not want the direct election of the president. Instead, they thought Congress was ideal. And they really, really wanted Congress to do this. If you read the debates at the time, they kept coming back to it. But they couldn't get around the problem of separation of powers. They debate this. The Constitutional Convention takes place throughout the summer of 1787, beginning in May and ending in September. And in late August, they had still not solved the problem of how to elect the president. They kept debating it. They finally gave it to a small committee called the Committee of 11, 11 people that were there. We don't really know what they talked about because the notes from that meeting burned in a fire a few years later. But we do know they came back to the convention with this system that we now have, the Electoral College system. We have made a few changes to it over the years, particularly after the election of 1800, when we had a tie because there was no way of separating the vote for president and vice president. And we call it the 12th Amendment, but really we still operate under that amendment. Now, for people that are familiar with prime ministerial systems, this really shouldn't sound that odd to you because in many countries, right, the prime minister is selected by the legislature. So again, it's an indirect election. That is essentially what we have, sort of a form of almost a prime ministerial system, but instead of Congress, we have this electoral college, as we call it, that selects the president. Will we ever change the system? There have been more than 700 proposals in Congress over the years to get rid of the electoral college system. It is extremely difficult to amend the US Constitution. It takes extraordinary majorities. And all of, in 1979, a majority of senators voted to propose an amendment to change the system. But a majority is not enough to amend the Constitution. You need a 2/3 vote of both houses of the US Congress, and then 3/4 of the states have to agree. It is probably too complicated for me to go into here, but there is something called the National Popular Vote Plan that is circulating throughout the United States, which tries to use, one might say, almost a loophole in the Constitution, the power that states have to determine how they run their elections, to go to a direct popular vote for president. And that is moving through the state legislatures. I think there are a lot of legal and constitutional problems with it, but there is a movement to try to change it.
Thank you very much. In the interest of representing our audience questions and clumping them together, I'll continue through a few other themes. We'll cover voting, transition of power, political parties, and democracy in general. On voting, Professor Sracic, will the United States ever implement compulsory voting for all eligible voters? Related, why is the participation rate of eligible US voters comparatively low to other mature democracies? Separate and related to one another, how does the US Census impact voting and the Electoral College? And does gerrymandering still exist?
Is that
correct?
Okay. So let's start with voter turnout. First, the question, will the US ever have compulsory voting? No, I cannot imagine. And in part because, again, it would be difficult to do that legally. Our federal government is a government of enumerated or listed powers. And the courts are fairly clear that if a power has not been given to Congress, Congress cannot do it. So there really would be nothing in the Constitution that would allow Congress to mandate voting. At the state level, it would be interesting, but I really don't think any governor would be able to do it either. We are a nation that guards our freedom, and people think that the freedom not to vote is one of their freedoms, right? So that I don't think will happen. That being said, turnout is really improving in the United States among the voting eligible population. Some people have made the argument for years that one of the reasons that we have low turnout is because we allow virtually everyone to vote. We have a very broad system. If you're over 18 and a citizen, you can vote for the most part. There's some restrictions, again, on people who have been in prison, but beyond that, we have a very broad electorate. In 2018, we saw a record number of people voting. Now, granted, that was only about half of those who are eligible, but that was a very strong turnout. And I expect this year for us to be a near record turnout in the presidential election, which will be above 60% of those who are eligible to vote. Actually, about 34 million people have already voted in this election. So that's about a quarter of all the people who we expect to vote have already participated. And there's a lot of excitement about this. We tend to have low turnout elections when people aren't excited about the candidates or feel like they don't have, a real choice. This year, people feel like they have a real choice. In 2018, they felt that. And so we're really seeing record turnout. And there are a lot of efforts in the United States to increase participation. As I told you, we started voting 2 weeks ago. in the state of Ohio, including this in-person absentee. That's a fairly recent development, and we're doing that to try to increase participation. So you don't have to just come on a single day. You have basically a month that you have to participate in the election and various ways of participating. So we've actually gotten a lot better at increasing access to the polls in the United States. And perhaps that's also helping us with voter turnout. There was a question about the impact of the census. The census is, of course, when we count our population. The impact of that on the presidential election is to alter the number of electoral votes that particular states have. I told you that Ohio has been seen as an important state, the state that I live in, because we have 18 electoral votes. I have been in Ohio for about 25 years, on and off. And when I first moved to Ohio, we had 21 votes for president. Now we have 18. That is because as people have recounted the United States, Ohio has not gained population, while other states like California, like Texas, like Florida have gained population, and we have redistributed members of Congress. That means we redistribute electoral votes. Finally, a question about gerrymandering, which, by the way, is correctly pronounced gerrymandering because it is named after somebody by the name of Elbridge Gerry, but everyone pronounces it gerrymandering in the United States. In fact, we had a big Supreme Court case involving gerrymandering a few years ago, and even the justices disagreed on how to pronounce it, with half of them saying gerrymander and half saying gerrymander. Nevertheless, as you know, what it means is drawing lines to achieve a particular political result. And you can favor a party based on how you draw the voting lines. We do have that in the United States for the drawing of congressional districts. It tends to be a political affair. However, again, we see a movement towards more democratization because gerrymandering can be a problem for democratization. And I just mispronounced it, gerrymandering. So you see many states, for example, the state of Ohio has now amended their state constitution to try to eliminate the sort of political drawing of districts. And we'll see, actually, I'm kind of excited in 2022 when we will actually redraw the lines to see how those lines are affected by the new way that we're doing it. Gerrymandering, however, does not affect presidential elections at all. Well, I should say that in most states. We do have two states, the state of Maine and Nebraska, that allocate the final electoral vote by congressional district as well as statewide vote. So one could argue that how the districts were drawn in those two states could make a difference. And if we have a very close election, that would be something we would be talking about.
Thank you very much. Along the same line with voting, in general, how secure would you assess the US electoral system? Is there high risk of voter fraud considering the wide-ranging requirements for identification or non-identification for mail-based voting, early voting across all of the 50 jurisdictions? Thank you.
I think the system is very secure. We don't have a lot of evidence of widespread voter fraud in the United States, and many people have studied this and have come to this conclusion. You might have, some minor incidents, but again, as I pointed out, in the state of Ohio, and we are not actually the strictest state when it comes to voter identification, but we do require quite a few forms of identification that you must show when you go to vote. So it's very hard to actually commit voter fraud. Even with absentee ballots, again, you have to know someone's social security number. And that is something that we keep very secure in the United States. In fact, even when you fill out your taxes, your tax form actually blanks out part of your social security number. So it's actually a fairly secure system. In some states, if you're going to vote absentee, you have to sign a statement asking for a ballot, and it has to be witnessed by someone else. So there are, again, it varies from state to state, but the states really do take this very seriously. The local boards of elections are very secure places. You can't just walk in as they collect the votes. In many states, for example, Ohio, the way we set up the people that run the election, you have to have an equal number of Democrats and Republicans. So the idea is that they're watching over each other to make sure that there's no voter fraud. So to have sort of massive fraud, you would have to have cooperation between the two parties. Clearly, there's no incentive to do that. I don't think you have to worry about it that much. We worry more about a breakdown of the system, of computer problems and things like that on election day, bad storms, things like that happening. But I think there is some talk of voter fraud. And also remember, with the mail-in voting, it's taking place, at least for the presidential election, in states that we don't really think are very competitive anyway. So it probably won't be a major issue.
Thank you. In general terms, in the recent presidential cycles, there appear to have been only 2 political parties represented on the national stage. Do third parties exist? And if so, are third parties ever competitive at the national level?
Yes, they exist, particularly the Libertarian Party and the Green Party. But there are multiple parties even beyond that that will be on various state ballots. But they don't tend to get even 1% of the vote. They generally have very low percentage of the vote. There are thoughts that they can make a difference by kind of stealing votes from one of the 2 major parties. That's controversial because we don't always know who that vote would have gone to or whether the person would have voted at all. But it is a little bit of a controversy. It's very difficult for third parties in the United States because we don't have any sort of proportionate voting, particularly at sort of the congressional level. So we tend to have single member districts. There's something called Duverger's law that political scientists talk about, that when you have single member districts, you tend to have only 2 political parties. So that's probably why we end up with that. We did back in the 1990s have a serious third party challenge for president. A businessman from Texas by the name of Ross Perot ran for president, and he got a significant number of votes. About 20% of the overall votes cast went for Ross Perot. But because we go state by state as we allocate electors, Perot actually didn't have a direct effect on the election, meaning he didn't win any electoral votes. If he had taken all those votes that he got in the United States, the popular vote, and confined them to a particular region or a particular state, then he would have won electoral votes, and then it would have really gotten interesting, I think, as we sort of selected the president. And in the future, if we have a third-party candidate, I think it would be more of a regional candidate. We had something like that, by the way, in 1968, when you had Governor George Wallace, who was actually a segregationist, who ran for president and actually won a number of states and won electoral votes. Not enough to deny either major party a majority, but he did. By the way, there is a procedure that we have should no one win a majority. And one of the things that we're looking at this year, because of how close things are, remember we have 538 electoral votes. That is an even number. That means you can have a 269 tie. in the electoral vote. So no possibility of a national popular vote tie, but you could have an electoral vote tie. If no one has a majority, the Congress then does select the next president, actually the House of Representatives. And it votes by state, not by individual. And by the way, it's not the current Congress that would vote, because if you remember the timeline I laid out, January 6th is when we count the votes. So we wouldn't know we had a tie until the 6th. The new Congress comes in on January 3rd.
Well, that's very interesting. I had never heard that. That's very interesting to me. In terms of election administration in the United States, here in Bangladesh, there is a National Election Commission, which helps administer rules and procedures across the nation. In the United States, is there a national body overseeing the election and electoral processes across all jurisdictions? And if so, what is its role?
Well, that's a complicated question. We do have national bodies that, for example, oversee campaign finance law and possible campaign finance regulations. There also is some national legislation, something called the Help America Vote Act, which provides funding and money, for example, for purchasing different machines that are used. But overall, most of our voting rules and most of the overseeing of elections is done at the state level. Most states have an office called the Secretary of State, and the job of the Secretary of State is to oversee elections in the end. So most of it is at the state level, but again, we take a lot of precautions, meaning that with this overseeing, even though, for example, in Ohio, the Secretary of State is a Republican, the local boards of elections, which oversee them at the local level, are equally staffed by Republicans and Democrats. So the answer to your question is not really, meaning we really don't have a lot of national oversight of our elections. Most of the oversight takes place at the state level. Of course, in the end, it is the Congress that counts the votes. And that does give them somewhat of an oversight role at the end. If we do have these disputes, ultimately the disputes are going to be decided by either Congress, or if it involves a technicality of the law, by the United States Supreme Court. And this was the case, for example, in 2000, when we had a very disputed election, particularly in the state of Florida. And we were disputing actually how to count the ballots. It was, I don't want to go into the system, but it was a very primitive system for voting that we don't use anymore. But it was hard to determine who actually won in the state of Florida. The Supreme Court ultimately made a decision stopping the counting of ballots. And in the end, that's how George W. Bush, became president. And again, you should realize that in 2000, even though there were some hard feelings, one might say, some anger between people, we did have a peaceful transition of power. The sitting Vice President Al Gore, who ran for president and lost a very controversial election, conceded his loss and actually participated in the counting of the votes, including Florida's, where he lost the election. So even when we've had controversial elections, we have still had the peaceful transfer of power.
Professor, we have time for one long answer or two relatively short answers. My next question for you is, in the United States, the administration of the election is complicated. The United States frequently participates with other entities to monitor elections overseas. Who monitors US elections? And who makes sure that votes are counted?
Well, again, I think this goes back to my prior response, in that most of the monitoring is done at the state level and at the local level. These are very, very public events. And again, I can speak to my own state, where both political parties watch over each other. This is a very typical American response, by the way. We often talk of sort of, checks and balances. It's in both parties' interest to watch out for the other party and make sure that they don't cheat. We do have sort of monitors on election day. You are allowed to have both parties, if they receive permission, it has to be official. You don't just show up. But in Ohio, for example, there are official poll monitors from each party. The parties will sometimes send out lawyers, for example, people skilled in election law, to watch what is happening at the polls, to monitor. And if they have a problem, they can go to court and sort of make an argument that something has been done incorrectly. So there is some oversight in that way, not a central body doing it. But again, there's incentive for both political parties to watch the other party and to monitor them. And we do have an open court system. So you can go in and make a challenge if you see something that you think is incorrect. And we do have a tradition of both political parties, even if they disagree with what the courts say, allowing or accepting the court's decision. And unless you're following US politics very closely, you wouldn't have noticed this, but already there has been somewhat of a monitoring by the court system of different changes that we have been making. Because, if a state makes a change, for example, the state of Pennsylvania just made a change in how they were counting votes, and the Republicans thought this was not an appropriate change, and they went to court. The state Supreme Court ruled against them. It was then appealed to the US Supreme Court. That appeal was recently denied. But you can see the court system as kind of a way of monitoring this, with both political parties having the incentive to bring suspicious activities or things that they think are inappropriate to the attention of the court system.
Thank you. I'm going to give you two final questions, I'm sorry. First, in American history, what provisions exist to facilitate the transition of power following an election? And then I'll get you the last one before we move to final comments.
It says in our US Constitution, when the new US presidential term begins. It talks in our Constitution about how we count the votes and determine who the winner is. We have congressional laws that have been in place for a long time about if there's a dispute in awarding these votes. So we have a lot of laws that govern this, but more importantly, I think we have a very strong tradition and sets of traditions. Now remember, we are a very old democracy. We have the oldest constitution in the world, continuously in operation. We've been doing this for a long time. And the American people have internalized many of these things, including the transition of power. If we have a dispute, it's going to be over how we count the votes. And again, if that is a dispute, ultimately it will go to the courts and it will go to Congress and it will be resolved. We will know, we've had elections, for example, in 1876, where there were many disputed electoral votes coming in from the states. Some states sent basically two sets of votes to be determined by Congress. We set up a panel, we determined who was correct, and actually the person who lost the popular vote ended up being awarded a majority of all the disputed electoral votes actually in 1876, and we had a peaceful transition of power. We went through that. So we do have some rules. They're complicated because we haven't dealt with the problem in a long time. They're written in a way that we might not write a modern law. So there is some dispute among lawyers as to how to understand them. But in the end, that's why we have a court system, to help us to understand, these disputes, resolve them, and ultimately, I think, determine who is going to be the winner, and Congress will declare who has the most electoral votes. That is going to be the next president of the United States, and we will have a transition of power, or a remainder in power, President Trump, on January 20th.
Professor, thank you. Final question. You said 34 million Americans have already voted. And this year, perhaps as much as 60% or more of the eligible voters will vote. How are voters encouraged to vote? Who helps spread the word to get out the vote and get to the polls?
Well, there's a lot of, civil society institutions that get involved in this. We have something called the League of Women Voters, which is very active in running programs. I'm actually participating in something this evening in the United States, a program like that, which is intended to get people excited about the election, to tell them how they can vote. If you watch television in the United States, you will see multiple commercials that are run out there, again, by a lot of civil society organizations, as well as the political parties, encouraging people to vote. What we do is, you have celebrities out there trying to do it. Sports stars get on. I just saw a bunch of commercials by sort of sports celebrities in the United States telling people, go out and vote, not telling them to vote for any particular candidate, but trying to get them to participate on college campuses. One of our big problems is young people don't participate in very high numbers. And there is something called Rock the Vote, where, musicians, very popular with young people, kind of get out there sometimes. With COVID, it's a little more difficult, but in the past, you've had these stars show up on campus and they try to recruit students to sign up. So there are active, efforts out there to increase, particularly voter registration. We have something called motor voter, meaning that when you go and get a driver's license, you're asked whether you're registered to vote. And if you're not, you're encouraged to register at that point. So we have these kind of drives. And again, it's in both parties' political interest to get their voters to show up. So they're using social media now, text messages. I get text messages on my phone almost every day now, reminding me to go and vote. So there's a lot out there of trying to sort of increase this. Again, this is both parties trying to get their own people out there to vote.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
During these 85 minutes now, you've shared a great deal with us about the fundamentals of the US election system, the Electoral College, federalism, transitions, vote counting. It's been very, very informative. In our final few minutes, Professor, do you have any closing remarks that you'd like to share with our guests about participation and democracy?
Well, first of all, thank you for the opportunity to speak to everyone today. This has been kind of very interesting to me, and I enjoyed the questions. Participation and democracy. As somebody who studies politics and studies it often from a historical perspective, it's taken the world a long time to sort of move in this direction, and the direction of democratization and democracy. It's a privilege in some ways to be able to do this. And my hope is that as you follow the news of the United States and the news of our election, that, in part you're going to hear many kind of negative things, because our politics is quite polarized in the United States now, with the two parties fighting with each other. But in the end, I hope you also see the US election as an example that even if the two parties are bitter rivals with each other, we still can come together, hold an election, participate in that, And even though it's seen oftentimes as kind of a negative thing, I will tell you that Election Day in the United States is somewhat of a celebration. Still, I think a celebration of democracy. You know, because of the virus, we are not able to vote in person as much as we have in the past. But if you actually experienced a US election on the ground in normal times, times when we don't have a virus, you would see that it is almost a celebration. People enjoy Election Day. They enjoy going to vote. They enjoy putting a sticker on them. We have flag stickers that we have with the US flag saying, "I voted," and people proudly wear those. So, you know, it's a very strong tradition in the United States. And I hope that you will still see us, I think, as somewhat of a role model of how this is done. We've been doing it for a long time. And look beyond a little bit, some of the tensions that you read about in the press, to take a more holistic view and see how the system works, even in times when you have bitter rivalries between the two political parties, as we're experiencing right now.
Professor Sracic, thank you so much for your time tonight. We appreciate your candor, transparency, adaptability to answer all of these questions. What you said rings true. The motto of the United States, E pluribus unum, out of many, one, out of many citizens representing places of origin across the world, out of many political parties, many states and disparate systems. We are, after all, one nation, and that diversity of opinion is our strength. Thank you so much for your time today. To everyone on this program, thank you for taking time to join us to learn more about the United States, our election system, and thank you for your continued participation in U.S. Embassy programs. Good night, everyone. Bye.